What exactly does all this mean? How does it work? Well, let's talk about with our legal eagles, former criminal defense attorney and former federal attorney Emily Campagno, and criminal defense and litigation attorney, former prosecutor Alex Little. Welcome to you both.
Good evening.
Thank you.
Okay, I want to start from a question that seems to come from the Manafort trial, where the primary witness against him was Rick Gates, who entered a deal and then testified against him. He was the star witness. John Horn tweets this: how is it fair Gates walks free and Manafort goes to jail? Gates stole almost $1 million from him. Alex?
Yeah, Gates isn't going free. He's pleaded guilty. He's had to admit his crimes. He's going to face a pretty significant sentencing exposure when he goes before the judge to get his sentence. So the government's going to cut him a deal in the sense that he'll get less exposure, less jail time than he would if he didn't cooperate. But he's certainly going to be a felon. He's going to be feeling that penalty for quite some time.
All right, Emily, this is a question I've gotten a lot. You guys probably have too over the last few days. This one comes from Fuddrucker1. Got to say that carefully. He says, let's say an offense is chargeable at both Fed and state levels. Does Fed immunity also mean the state can't prosecute?
Right. So generally speaking, the jurisdictions have basically a respect for one another, and you can't really use that testimony that was compelled by another jurisdiction. But note that at the state level, something called transactional immunity is often used, and that's not recognized at the federal level. That's basically a blanket immunity. And what that looks like is that the feds indeed can prosecute that witness for the activities associated with that underlying issue, but simply not use their testimony. And it's important for viewers to understand that a lot of these rules aren't as black and white as one with immunity would hope or want them to be. So if they have an independent source of evidence, you can always be prosecuted.
Okay, so next up, people want to know about how long this can last. At Shane Hardy 58 says, is there a statute of limitations on the immunity deal? If you take immunity, can they come back a year later and question or indict you then? How does it work?
Yeah, so immunity is basically a contract between the prosecutor, the government, and this defendant or this cooperator. And so the terms of that depend. But generally, if they induce you to do anything, if they require you to testify, once you've done something for them, their obligation to return the favor and to uphold their end of the bargain doesn't end.
Yeah, and it can be that they're not going to prosecute you for certain things, or, you know, there can be minutia in the way this whole thing is done. It's not going to be just you can get away with any crime from now on that's connected to this possibly.
That's always in the past.
Yeah, and a lot of questions now about credibility. Steve Reason tweets us, never understood these deals. How can witness have any credibility? Emily, how is that explained to the jurors? How does this work?
Right. Well, oftentimes, so in a trial, for example, prosecutors would basically say, look, if you have information on the bigger fish, right, with the more unconscionable crimes that we're hoping that you will actually convict here, that, of course, he's not going to be associated with choir boys. So you have to look that aside, however. You have to believe that this witness here, while he's despicable potentially with his conduct, that he's credible and that he was a part of the organization or whatever it was, and thus he knows. But you're absolutely right that that's often called into question. And that's also why corroborating evidence is so important on the part of the prosecutor, so that the jury can feel comfortable with both forms of evidence.
Yeah, it's interesting because we had one of the Manafort jurors, Paula Duncan, speak with us right the day after the trial, and they come to their decision. And it was interesting because the prosecution had made Rick Gates in the Manafort trial such the star key linchpin of the whole thing, and yet the jurors, at least her, and she said there were others, really didn't believe him, or they questioned his credibility. They looked at how much he'd stolen from his employer. They had other issues with him, but the prosecutors put together such a good paper trail for her that they were able to look aside from Rick Gates, knowing he had a deal, and then follow the paper trail. Okay, so this one, I got a lot of questions about Hillary Clinton, and a number of people close to her were given immunity deals as she was going into that final questioning with the FBI before they made their decision not to prosecute her. This question, or this tweet, comes from Deplorable Henry, saying the Clinton lawyers who received immunity deals, can they ever be prosecuted for anything connected to Hillary? Alex?
Sure, it depends a lot on what those deals were. My suspicion, there wasn't really detailed reporting on this, is that when a federal prosecutor wants to talk to someone, oftentimes a lawyer like me is going to say, you know what, I don't want you to talk to my client unless you promise not to use this information against them. And that sort of immunity about the specific details of that crime would never be able to be allowed to be used. But if there were other issues or other crimes, or if they'd lied in the course of talking to the government, they could be prosecuted.
Okay, Emily, you touched on this. We have a question from Fuddrucker again, Fuddrucker1. He had several good questions, he or she. Said there are different types of immunity. You touched on this. For instance, I've heard of transactional immunity. What are the differences in the types? So, yeah, for people who aren't legal eagles like you, Emily, how does that work? What are they?
Right. So, like I mentioned earlier, transactional immunity is basically a blanket immunity, right? And that covers everything involved with that particular activity. And then use and derivative use means it's a little bit narrower, and it's basically the use of that testimony and then anything that follows from it. So that could be crimes associated with it. So think of it as, if an immunized witness is testifying about a bank robbery and then admits that he purchased illegal drugs with that money that he stole from the bank, then that's something that's an example of transactional versus use and derivative use. Can that be prosecutable? And then again, remember, if there's an independent source, you're never scot-free.
All right, we got to leave it there. We have more questions, but you guys have been so enlightening and helpful. Emily and Alex, thank you both. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Hurricane Lane.